The Club of Rome is a global network of independent and renowned thinkers. The Club of Rome analyzes today's challenges facing the world, their root causes, and the possible futures in a systematic and holistic manner. The Club of Rome encourages global debate in order to set in motion actions that by the middle of the century will ensure a more secure, equitable, and prosperous world.
As we grow richer, there is rising concern about pollution, our ability to feed a growing population, and fears that we may run out of fuel and metals.
A computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has been used to look at these problems, to analyze in broad terms the direction in which our world is headed. Sponsored by a group of businessmen and academics, the Club of Rome, its conclusions are revolutionary.
The most important lesson is that we're near the end of our development of society, which has been going on for about 2,000 years. That we've reached levels of prosperity which carry the seeds of disruption and necessitate a complete relook at the whole world's social, political, and other situations.
It's telling us that the world is in a completely unstable situation and is likely to fall to pieces if it doesn't stop growing.
Population now doubles in 30 years. Man now uses twice as much energy as he did 15 years ago, and industrial production has nearly trebled in the last 15 years. If we use known stocks at present rates, there will be no copper left in 2008, no zinc in 1995, no tin in 1989, and no mercury in 1985. There will be no silver, without which we cannot make films, in 1987.
Such growth threatens to use up all the resources the Earth has to offer us. Such are the enormous needs of the industrial society in progress.
The Industrial Revolution has consumed vast quantities of fossil fuels, for example, and now there aren't many left. And it's as simple as that. If you have a kind of society which is going to eat the very planet we're on, eat it up, consume it, you will find that there's nothing left.
It has been developed to exploit the ecosystem without taking into account its continued existence. And our new technologies tend to disrupt ecological cycles, to break them, to intrude harmful, unnatural materials on them, and therefore to destroy the base of its own existence. Because of that, we are on a suicidal course.
What we're really being told is that although nobody knows for sure exactly when it will happen or exactly what risk is the greatest risk man faces, scientists are fairly unanimous in saying that man does face extremely important risks.
When global population is doubling every 33 years, when resource consumption is doubling every 20 years, no long-term view of mankind can proceed without first forming some preliminary answers to these questions.
Professor Dennis Meadows, at a conference in Washington to mark the publication of his team study for the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth. It concludes that economic growth always generates a crisis, that the road to riches is the road to disaster.
Even if we solve problems like pollution, growth within a century or so would lead to widespread famine and social chaos. Dennis Meadows and his team used a computer. He explains why.
Predictive modeling systems are essentially a mathematical computation of criteria that can come in all shapes and sizes. But not since Malthus's catastrophe has one been more influential than the World 3 model, used to a very similar predictive end by the Club of Rome in their world-changing 1972 publication, Limits to Growth. Back in 1968, the argument of exponential growth on a finite planet had gained some new footing by way of funding, and the MIT study was soon underway. Given that the club's membership is by nature comprised of the who's who among the highest-ranking officials in international business and academic leadership, perhaps it's no surprise that this study's impact has been almost as long-lasting as it was immediate. With millions of copies sold in multiple languages across the globe, the club's introduction of scenario-based calculations to account for the multiple courses of possible action was more than a conversation starter. It was a game changer. Truly, if you're going to try and convince the governments of the world that taking your advice is the only way to avoid an otherwise certain disaster, then playing out a series of likely scenarios by way of predictive modeling has really become the only way to go. Also, a giant state-of-the-art computer probably doesn't hurt. Co-founders Alexander King and Aurelio Pache both shared a burning desire to revolutionize the mechanisms of international policymaking. Their driving motivations stem from the frustrations regarding the many bureaucratic processes that slow down the significant, yet necessary changes needed to not only avoid catastrophe, but also bring the world into what they believe to be an achievable state of sustainable equilibrium, which is why they intentionally formed the Club of Rome to be formless. Though they had a president, no one was ever officially elected, and all of their decisions were made by an executive committee of around 8 members, including the founders themselves. Their goal was to form a direct link between the committee and relevant decision makers within the revolving but incredibly prestigious and exclusive membership. They'd meet monthly to address the accumulating series of issues, coined by club members as the problématique, which is a term meant to encompass the interconnected and complex nature of environmental and social problems we face. Since their rise to prominence, there have been a lot of questions raised about the Club of Rome, many of which they've already answered. So instead of explaining more, let's allow them to tell us in their own words who they are and what they're all about.
Because of the high population levels and the increasing industrialization, natural resources are depleted at an increasing rate, and finally they fall down to the point where the industrial system can no longer be sustained.
Skeptics say forecasts of doom are the result of doomsday assumptions. Make different assumptions, change the equations a little, you will produce very different results. If you put nonsense into a computer, they say, you get nonsense out.
I think that's a very reasonable response. The question comes, of course, is it possible to put something into the computer which can be defended as reasonable, which alters the conclusions? I'm rather confident that while in the precise nature of our conclusions there will ultimately be made changes, that the general conclusions, the fact that growth has a tendency to resolve itself through collapse, those conclusions are simply not going to be altered by any reasonably defensible additions to the model.
The computer does not predict. It sketches the direction in which our world is moving. It clarifies some of the conflicts between the natural and the man-made world. Nature is balance. Tamper with one part of it, and the complex and unexpected will turn up in another part. That is what the study shows.
If this study is right, then our society is threatened. No one knows when or how. But if it does mirror the world, if we can see in our problems the stresses of growth, then the world is unstable. Growth, it seems, has an awful logic.
It is so obvious, in a way. It's so simple to consider that we cannot continually and exponentially go as we are doing now. Nothing in the world, nothing in life grows continuously.
What then if we stopped getting richer? Is it possible to produce a stable world? Were there policies which would create equilibrium, a balanced world? They found that if you controlled everything, including industrial production, no crisis emerged. But this assumes that we will stop getting richer.
Population was stabilized by effective birth control from 1975. Food production is stabilized using modern techniques at a high level. The key factor, industrial growth, was leveled off in 1975 too, enabling pollution, also carefully controlled, to be kept within bounds. Resources, carefully used, are falling gradually.
When these are implemented in 1970, we see that the world system is capable of moving into an equilibrium society, a stable state system, which can be sustained as long as we analyze it through the computer.
What is being suggested is that the only way to ensure the future for our grandchildren is to stop getting richer. Only then will there be the resources and the unpolluted world that they will need to survive. when the study talks of equilibrium, it is talking about halting this kind of growth, the kind that consumes resources and pollutes the environment. But what would equilibrium be like for people?
I think it could be extremely pleasant. We're not suggesting a deterioration of material standards as being necessary to an extent which should in fact frighten many people.
There's going to have to be a shift away from an emphasis on material goods to one on the social services. There has to be a shift which views man as part of a total system rather than as man, a person who has been given a system for his exploitation. It's important, I think, to realize when we talk about this stable state that describes a large number of possible alternatives. We're not talking about some uniform society which would blanket the globe. Certainly not talking about that type of uniformity. We're talking about a system in which the various balances between material output and population can be engineered more or less to suit the particular objectives of a society.
Equilibrium will be a very different world. It could also be a very varied world, a world with all kinds of societies. But they will all be societies radically different from ours. If it is right, then this study forewarns us of a watershed in human history.
It's wholly revolutionary in its very nature. Hitherto, we've had revolutions thrust upon us by people who couldn't stand it any longer, and then there is bloodshed and all sorts of horrors. Now, we now know, I contend, that we have to have a revolution, and we ought to be able to plan it.
Let's not overlook the fact that human society has gone through a number of revolutions in their implications, even perhaps more profound than the one we're talking about today. Just at the dawn of history, of man's history, we saw a transformation from hunting and gathering and nomadism to settled agriculture. The impact of that on man's religion, on his institutions, on his view of himself, were enormously profound. The shift from rural to industrialized man has been an enormous change. The shift from a primarily agricultural to a primarily urban population has an enormous impact.
Our own society reflects its origins, the Industrial Revolution. That revolution molded our institutions, changed our politics, and shaped our lives. The Stability Revolution, the Equilibrium Revolution, whatever future historians choose to call it, will also shape and change the way we live.
It's important that everyone should have a concept of the world as a whole and should avoid as far as possible bringing up their children in any sense of local patriotism, nationalism, and parochialism.
It's important for you, I think, to realize that you have really the right only to have 2 children, to expect that you're going to have to make short-term sacrifices if they're to have a decent environment and the resources necessary to pursue the kind of life that they should have.
First of all, inform yourself. First of all, become interested. Then let your political leaders, both locally and nationally, know that you're interested and show them that you're informed. Then look at your own habits as consumers, as producers, in the things that you do in your daily life, and ask yourself what effect they're having on the whole problem. Are they making a positive contribution, or are you part of the problem?
This transition from the present type of society for the new society, which will be balanced with its environment and within, depends on all of us, on all of you. And that will require political action.
Men, for the first time in the history of man, have the opportunity to design the society they want and the resources to put that into effect. Now, that is the guts of the matter to me. We have to think out just what society do we want. We can have it, you know.
We have to imagine what world we would like.
Perhaps, it seems, our children could live our dreams.